In these next lessons, we're going to be looking at attacks on networks and information systems. There are two primary categories of attacks. The more common in the earlier days were more of the browsing attacks. These were not targeted attacks. They were opportunistic in nature. In other words, we're going to bump into as many nodes as we possibly can, and whatever nodes are vulnerable to my particular type of attack, those are the ones that I'm going to get, the victims that I'm going to be able to attack. It wasn't so targeted. It was more just kind of grazing. They called them machine gun, spray and pray, shotgun, drive-by attacks. Basically, we didn't know or care who we were attacking. We just attacked, and we bumped into everybody. Some people had their defenses up, and I wasn't successful, and others didn't have their defenses up, and I was able to accomplish what I wanted. So the common approach here was a virus or a worm or some script that I write, and I put it on a website, and it runs some processes on your computer if you download my script. And if you have your defenses up, the script won't run. But if you don't have your defenses up, like many non-sophisticated computer users might not know how to configure their defenses, then my script is going to run and I'm going to own your box. So these were the browsing attacks. And this is the way the bulk of attacks occurred all through history up until about 4 or 5 years ago, when some really good bad guys, and I don't mean good in a good sense, I mean they were talented bad guys, started formalizing their procedures, and they started targeting the more successful and profitable victims. So we might even refer to these as the newer family of these. The most sophisticated we've seen today is called the Advanced Persistent Threat, the APT. Here is where we will actually choose the victim. We'll select a target first, and then we'll recon that target. We'll study them. We'll anonymously nose around on their website. Now, there's an awful lot that, as an anonymous browser of a website, there's an awful lot of potential information that you can glean about the server itself, about the nature of the scripts that are running. Can I poison one of these scripts? About the infrastructure behind the web server. Because a lot of time the resources that a web server pushes down don't actually live on that web server. They has to reach back across the network and grab stuff. Well, if I can find those links, I now know more about your background infrastructure. So as passively as I can, I'm going to study and research and figure out who you are. And then over time, once I kind of exhaust those avenues, I'll become more and more visible as, hey, what is that guy doing out there? Anonymously, I'm a nobody. They don't even see me. But now that I might be probing your network a little bit, they'll say, hey, we just got scanned by somebody in Oshkosh. They might be able to recognize me. So this is recon. And the lower level is all passive. It's done through sniffing and browsing and using anonymous and publicly available information, study the potential target. And then I'll get more and more active, and that's where I begin to risk some exposure. And my goal here is to first footprint the target environment. And that's kind of getting a general lay of the land to identify where there might be juicy targets. Is there a segment over this way and a segment over that way? And there's some resources back here. Once I get this footprinting done, this general lay of the land, I'll identify specific targets that I'm interested in. This is called fingerprinting. And I'll go interrogate that one specific server, for example, to try and identify its operating system, the applications it's running, the services it's running, the user accounts that might be there, things along these lines. And the more I can glean about that particular computer, server, if you will, the more I will understand where it might have vulnerabilities, because there is a database of known vulnerabilities, and many of these vulnerabilities still have not been repaired, patched, if you will. So if I can identify that you're running a particular version of Windows and SQL Server and you're running these 3 services, I might have 10 or 20 potential exploits that might attack vulnerabilities relative to those pieces of software that server is running. And so that's the fingerprinting now, where I'm studying a single device and I'm enumerating the details, the user accounts, the services, the applications, the protocols, the ports, the IP addresses, etc., that this one box is using. And I'm documenting this, so I'm building my profile of my potential victim. Through this fingerprinting and enumeration is where I can do my vulnerability assessment. How can I break in? Now that I understand how I can break into this one box, and I might have 20 exploits and 18 of them are already defended because you've patched or you've got a filter on your firewall or whatever, I might get one or two that work. And all it takes is one or two and you can break into a box and boom, that's the exploit. This is where I successfully compromise the box and I begin to take control of the box. I am now an unauthorized user on that target box. My goal here is to eventually raise my privilege level on that system to that of the administrator or the root. This is the top level of authority and I can go anywhere and do approximately anything I want to on that box. So once I get into the box, I'll nose around a little bit, but I'll very soon try to escalate my privilege to some higher level where I can do what I want on the box. And as I get more and more control over the box by escalating my privilege level on the box, I'll also be covering my tracks. See, some of the tracks that I put down as I'm banging into this box with my exploits and trying to escalate my privilege level, some of these are going to leave marks that I can't hide yet. But once I become root or administrator on a box, depending on the operating system, now I can start to delete some of this stuff and I can cover my tracks. Also at this point, a good bad guy is now going to turn around and is going to harden this box. In other words, I'm going to fix all the vulnerabilities you didn't even know you had on the box. Why? Because I've worked hard to break into your box and make it my box, and I don't want another bad guy to take my box away from me. So I'm going to defend your box, which is now my box, from the bad guy who wants to take it away from both of us. So a good bad guy at the stage 6 where he's covering his tracks will also tend to shore up your defenses for you if you haven't done a good job. Now that I'm fully entrenched in this box, I can start to pillage. This is where I take whatever I want and I have my way with this box and I install whatever resources I want on it and I can steal whatever secrets I want off of it and I'll fully exploit this box and take everything I want off of this server, for example. And once I've taken everything I want off of this box, I now will use this box because it is in a trusted position in your computing environment. I will use your box as my attack point, and I'll pivot and attack deeper into your network using this system. So this is the nature of the targeted attacks. This is a full phase attack, and these are the components that would be included in what we call the new advanced persistent threat. The goal is eventually, over time, no hurry, very low profile, very low threat of being detected, fully compromise the box. Take everything you want from the box, and now use this box at your discretion, very often to penetrate deeper and steal more in the corporate environment, and the victim never knows that you were there. That's the goal of the advanced persistent threat. And what makes this so scary is this is now becoming more and more a common approach in a corporate world for corporate espionage. Also, there is new government-sponsored targeted attacks that will use this very low and slow and sophisticated, very difficult to detect type of attack. If I haven't scared you enough, maybe you'll come back for the next lesson. This lesson will cover the denial of service attack and the distributed denial of service attack. Now, the denial of service attack was one of the earliest types of attacks, and the goal of the denial of service attack is to eliminate the availability of some valuable IT resource. Maybe I'm corrupting your database and you can't get your data out of the database. Maybe I cause your server to crash so that you can't access your own server. Maybe I disable the network interface card on your web server and now your customers can't use your web server to buy through the e-commerce portion of the web server. So these are attacks that target the availability of information or networking services. And there's a whole family of them. These were the easy ones, relatively easy attacks, because in the early days, the network was designed and developed with the notion of how are we going to make this thing work? And it was all about making it work. And nobody really paid much attention to how will somebody use this network to screw things up? And that's where these denial of service attacks, relatively easy denial of service attacks, came into play. And that is because we were so focused on making it work, we never really paid attention to how do we defend the network from somebody who's trying to break the network. The original notion was, well, why would somebody do that? Well, they do. The bad guy simply wants to mess things up for the challenge, for the sport, for the game, or maybe for some financial benefit. Maybe he's your competition and he doesn't want you selling your product because if the customers can't get to your website, they might come to his website and buy his product. Things along these lines. So a whole family of these. The first one is called the Sin Flood. Took advantage of the TCP three-way handshake, and it built a half a session and then never completed the session. Only it would build half a session 1,000,000 times over and flood the target system with so many TCP sessions that were incomplete, incomplete if you will, that the server can no longer handle a legitimate inbound request for a TCP session. The teardrop and the smurf, the ping of death, and the land attack are all attacks that are designed using legitimate protocols but misusing the legitimate protocol so that the target system can no longer function correctly and handle legitimate requests for service. And so that's a denial of service attack. Anytime you can break their box or their access to the data, you have denied them that service. And as a result, they are going to lose money, and for some reason that must be to your benefit since you're the bad guy. Now, the distributed denial of service attack takes some advantage of some of those features from time to time, but really is a little bit larger scale. And here's the way this works. Over time, a bad guy will compromise many systems using the opportunistic browsing types of attacks. In other words, he will populate the internet, if you will, with, let's say, 100,000 compromised systems. Over time, over a 6-month or even a year or even longer period, he'll implant his unknown virus on these boxes. And because the payload hasn't fired yet, it hasn't done anything yet. These boxes aren't doing anything except monitoring a communications channel, which I'll describe in just a minute. So over time, we compromise many boxes, as many as we can. Now, these boxes are eventually going to be referred to as zombies, and they may also be referred to as bots, because my virus that I've infected these computers with is monitoring an IRC communications channel. Typically, it's using the Internet Real-Time Chat, IRC, and that's because these are anonymous communications. So I've compromised that box over there, and now I've programmed that box to every hour go look at this chat room, and if he sees over the last hour that somebody has input the command or the sentence, Bobo was here, he's looking for that phrase. If he sees that phrase, that triggers some action on his part. So that's what my Trojan, that's what my virus is doing on that compromised box. And so I'll, over time, increase these number of compromised boxes, building my army of zombies or my botnet. Those two terms are approximately synonymous. And these are compromised systems that are monitoring this anonymous communications channel. And as I build my army bigger and bigger, I might sell it, or I might use it to really focus an attack on some other corporation that I have some grievance with. So now I'm getting more and more powerful as I increase the number of zombies or bots in my army of zombies or botnet. Now, when I'm ready to pull the trigger and actually evoke the attack, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take another compromised box, and this one isn't going to be one of my zombies. This one I'm going to call a handler. And this is a compromised box who is looking at a different chat room. And this time he's not looking for Bobo was here. He's looking for Lulu was here, for example. And so I, the true attacker, will log on to the IRC chat room and say Lulu was here. And my handlers, maybe 100 of them, I'll have 100 handlers, are going to be monitoring this chat room every hour. And they'll see that sentence, Lulu was here. And they will turn around and communicate using the other chat room and post the message, Bobo was here. And the compromise boxes, the zombies, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands or more compromised box, the zombies or bots, will see that command, Bobo was here, and they will turn around and execute the attack on whoever the victim is. And sometimes those communications will include enough information to identify the victim and the type of attack on the victim, the timing of the attack, things along these lines. And other times that will be embedded in the virus itself. I'll already know who the target is and the nature of the attack. And I just pull the trigger using these commands through these IRC chat rooms because they allow me layers of anonymity. And some of these attacks include the Tribal Flood, Trinu, and MyDoom. These are some of the more famous distributed denial of service attacks. And there are continued variants of these types of attacks, but very often these are denial of service attacks on a singled out target, a well-focused, well-targeted attack, well-coordinated, and through layers of anonymous chat rooms, I make it very difficult for the attack to be traced back to me, the true attacker. So this has been the denial of service attack and the distributed denial of service attack. Let's continue our lessons now with a review of the different types of information theft. This is where the bad guy breaks in and steals your information. The first and easiest one is referred to as sniffing, and this is using what might be called a protocol analyzer, packet analyzer, a sniffer. These are applications or devices that we can attach to the network, whether it's wired or wireless, and we simply capture the information that's flowing back and forth across this network. If there are encrypted channels, then anything that's encrypted, of course, while I can capture the packet, the payload is going to be gibberish to me and it's unintelligible, and I don't get any usable data out of it unless, of course, I take the time and crack the encryption. Now, this can take a very long time. Today's cryptology is very, very sophisticated, and if they're using good crypto, it might take me years, decades, centuries, millennium to break into their ciphertext. So very often, if it's encrypted, that encryption is strong enough that there's almost no point in trying to break into it. So this is a relatively anonymous form of eavesdropping, and it's a very easy way to steal information. If the network is wireless, or if it's using unshielded twisted pair, and these are the two most common forms of network communications today, these types of technologies emanate the data signal into the air. So as you're sending packets through that wireless network or through that Ethernet network, there are electromagnetic waves in the airspace that a good bad guy can pick up and steal those data streams. So this is emanations detection. Now, the way to defend against emanations detections is by use of shielding, maybe a Faraday cage, or you can also populate the environment with something called white noise. In other words, I'm kind of jamming the signal. I populate the environment with radio frequency energy that is a higher level, so high that you can't read my emanation signals because they are substantially weaker. And in all that noise, you can't identify the true data from the noise. Now, the man-in-the-middle attack is where the bad guy spoofs both a legitimate server or service and also then spoofs a legitimate user. And the client thinks that the bad guy, the man in the middle, is the legitimate service, so he's communicating back and forth freely with what he thinks to be is the legitimate service. Meanwhile, that bad guy, man in the middle, is going to turn around and pretend to be that legitimate user to the legitimate service. And as a result, he is now the man in the middle. And he is able to intercept 100% of the communications between the true client and the true legitimate service. And he's able to compromise the confidentiality, the integrity, or the availability of that information as it flows through him in the middle. Now, the bad guy can also hijack a network or a website or something along these lines. Let's talk about this. If I can break into the routing system of a network, I can cause the routing system to send all of their traffic through my segment where I'm perhaps going to run a sniffer. This way I can steal any data that isn't encrypted. And I might hijack your website. In other words, I pretend to be your website and I poison the DNS so that when a client thinks he's going to boboville.com, he's really going to badguy.com, but I've made it look like it's at boboville.com. And now the bad guy doesn't know that I'm sending down my malicious software to his browser every time he hits my website. So this would be a form of hijacking. ARP cache poisoning poisons the layer 2 MAC address information. That's what ARP does. It does IP address to MAC address resolution, and then the client will cache that mapping in RAM for some period of time. Typically, it's 10 to 12 minutes. Now, if I can inject my mapping of the legitimate IP address, only the bad guy MAC address, into that ARP cache, now the legitimate client thinks he's sending his data to the legitimate server, but really he's sending it to me, the bad guy. This is one way to invoke this man-in-the-middle attack. Same with DNS poisoning and route poisoning. These also allow for either man-in-the-middle or hijacking attacks. So DNS poisoning is where I break into a DNS server that stores the mappings of friendly names, fully qualified domain names like www.boboville.com, and it has its legitimate IP address posted there in that mapping. But if I can break into the DNS server, I can put my bad guy IP address into that mapping. So now when you think you're going to boboville.com, you're actually coming to badguy.com and allowing me to send you whatever it is I feel like sending you. Or I pretend to be the legitimate site and I trick you into sending me your username and password so I can turn around and go clear out your account or steal your credit card information, whatever. Traffic analysis is not actual theft of data other than I can identify trends. I can tell when something is happening. If I know about your business because of the reconnaissance that I've already implemented on your business, I might be able to tell when you're sending out your payroll data, for example, or you're processing your credit cards. I can tell when you're processing your credit cards because of the nature of the traffic. Now I can go to the processor and break into his network today because I know he's got all those new credit card numbers. So through traffic analysis, not the actual analysis of the information, the detailed information that the traffic contains, but just the increase of some type of traffic or the decrease or the nature of the traffic as it changes, I can glean conclusions about the nature of what's happening, and this might trigger me with some intelligence to more accurately, more effectively attack and compromise your environment. Now, we talked about the distributed denial of service attack that uses IRC, Internet Real-Time Chat, instant messaging in chat rooms, and I can use these tools to help to steal information. Most of the time, these are anonymous. Most of the time, these don't have encryption, and many times, people will put all sorts of highly sensitive information in these chat rooms. Plus, I can use these chat rooms to my benefit to help me orchestrate attacks. So the very anonymous and almost always clear text communications through instant messaging and chat rooms allow me to steal that information and allow me a free and anonymous channel to effectively communicate and help coordinate my attacks. Another form of information theft is through the use of something called a backdoor or a maintenance hook. Now, when a software developer is writing his program, there's a fair amount of trial and error. He'll write his code and then he has to go test it. But he doesn't want to have to go all the way back through the application to test it, so he'll build this little entryway, this little maintenance hook it's called. It's a doorway into his program without going through all the authentication and authorization challenges that you bump into when you first log into an application. He wants to jump right into the program right before this piece that he's been working on because he just wants to test this piece and kind of debug it and work it out. So very often during development, the developer will legitimately have a use for this maintenance hook. This is a backdoor. It's unauthenticated avenue into the application for testing purposes, and it's legitimate testing purposes. That's great. The problem is these developers will very often intentionally or unintentionally leave these maintenance hooks in the code because they didn't want to take the time, they forgot, or they know there's still a problem there and they're going to have to go clean it up later. So I'm just going to leave that maintenance hook right there because I know I have to go work on this again later. Now, when the bad guys can identify these maintenance hooks in the application, this is their easy backdoor. They now know how to step into the application, bypassing all the legitimate authentication and authorization mechanisms that are in place on the front end of the application. Also, if a bad guy can compromise a system, he very often will inject Trojaned applications that include the backdoor so that he can come into this system anytime he cares to, over and over and over again. So the bad guys will very often inject these backdoors, usually through a Trojan horse type of application, and be able to bypass authentication and authorization mechanisms that might already be in place on the box. And finally, this last one isn't really a high technique. This is a low-tech attack at stealing information, and this is called dumpster diving. And the notion here is people don't ever really pay that much attention to what it is they're throwing away and just how sensitive that stuff is that they're throwing away. And once you put a piece of information or a hard drive or a floppy disk or a CD-ROM in the trash, and that trash gets put out for collection, in most cases, it is declared that there is no ownership of that item. In other words, you've given up ownership of that item and nobody owns it, which means it's not exactly against the law for a bad guy to come take it. It's not theft anymore. You've given it away, in essence. So we have to be very careful about destroying anything that contains any sensitive information to avoid the threat of dumpster divers being able to compromise and steal value from your enterprise. This is also appropriate for home users as well. Be concerned about what you throw in your own personal trash because somebody might be looking through your garbage and stealing your identity or other valuable components of your worth and your value. We'll take a pause here and pick up shortly. In this lesson, we're going to continue on with different types of attacks. This particular attack is referred to as the advanced persistent threat. Now, this is a relatively new type of attack, and it is very often corporate sponsored or perhaps even government sponsored. It is highly targeted, it is highly sophisticated, it's called low and slow with a very low potential for being detected. The goal is break in, doesn't matter how long it takes, break in, take what you want, and go away, and they'll never even know we were here. That's the goal. So it uses a very slow and stealthy approach, a whole lot of reconnaissance, study the target, identify vulnerabilities, and the moment you think maybe they've noticed something, you completely obliterate any trace of that particular action, and you come in at a different angle from a different attack vector. And so the goal is we don't want them to know that we've ever been here. Don't let them know that you broke in, that you're breaking in. Not only breaking in, I don't want them to know when I've stolen their stuff, and I don't want them to know when I've cleaned up and left their place. They should never even know that I've been here. So this is highly targeted. It is one of the scariest types of attacks. We're seeing it happen more and more often. Some examples are the Stuxnet, Dooku, and Flame attacks, all in kind of the same family of attack, and these all fit into this advanced persistent threat type of attack, where you might study your target for a year before you ever start to inject any sort of malware. So it's a highly skilled attacker, slow, determined, stealthy. This is where we will use all phases of the attack, and that would be the recon, the footprinting, the fingerprinting, the enumeration, the exploit and compromise phase, the escalation of privilege, the covering of tracks, the hardening of the asset to defend your new asset so some other bad guy doesn't steal it, the pillaging of the resources, and eventually the pivoting and attacking deeper into the enterprise. Now, that pivot and attack is an option here because the goal is we don't ever want the victim to know that we were there. As compared to earlier attacks were not targeted. They were, let's grab the low-hanging fruit. Let's find the easy targets and we'll take them. They didn't know or care who those targets were or what they were going to get. They just figured if I can bump into 1,000,000 boxes, I might get 1,000 compromised boxes. And you know what? I'll make some benefit from those 1,000 boxes. Well, that's not the advanced persistent threat. That's the way early attacks worked. Today, the attacks are much more focused, much more stealthy, much more talented and skilled, and they are corporate or government sponsored with massive amounts of resources. Another form of attack or justification for attacks called this hacktivist. Now, this is somebody who hacks into a network or an enterprise just so they can draw attention to their cause. It might be about cruelty to animals. It might be about some sort of degradation of the environment or something along these lines. So they try to break into an enterprise or a network so that they can get publicity. They might be able to stop some action like the injuring of animals or the further fracking of the surrounding terrain. The hacktivist wants attention, whereas the guy who's committing the advanced persistent threat does not want any attention. He's on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from the hacktivist. Let's move forward and we'll look at cell phones, threats from cell phones. Now, in the early days, we had problems where a bad guy would get your code off of your cell phone and he would clone that same authentication code into his cell phone, and now he's using your minutes. Because the cellular company, the carrier service that you're paying, can't tell the difference between your telephone and his telephone. To them, they're both legitimately your telephone, and you're going to get billed for his minutes. So cloning was one of the early threats to cellular service. In the early days in cellular, that authorization code was sent in clear text. So a bad guy could simply set his recorder up in some city park, sit there and spend the nice day feeding the squirrels and soaking up the sunshine. Meanwhile, he's collecting the cell phone authentication codes, and then will go home and program his cell phones with those codes, and he'll be using your minutes, not his minutes. When it was recognized that this cloning was occurring, the cellular companies effectively started encrypting these authentication codes. So that defeated this particular attack. Oh, but wait a second. The bad guy doesn't need to know a specific authentication code. He needs any successful authentication code. And each cellular customer has their own legitimate, authentic, usable authentication code. So he only has to find one out of, 100 million or so authentication codes. In other words, there are many, many, many codes that he could guess, and this is a trial and error approach. He'll guess at these authentication codes, test, and if it doesn't work, he'll guess the next one. He'll guess the next one. This is called tumbling. So all he has to do is find one that works, and he doesn't care if it's yours or somebody else's code. As long as he can find one that works, he'll tumble on and tumble on and tumble on and tumble on until he finds one that works. Boom, he now is using your minutes. There's another threat called the gap in the WAP. WAP is Wireless Authentication Protocol. And this is a security protocol used by the cellular services. And basically what this says is, I'm encrypting your communications from your cell phone to the cellular tower and to the earth station at the foot of that cellular tower. And at the foot of that cellular tower is this earth station that has to decrypt this WAP encrypted communication, and it then has to convert that into the appropriate encryption for the internet or whatever network you're communicating with. So we have a server at the foot of some cell tower that has clear text communications. And if some bad guy can break into this location, and how many cell towers are there? A lot. So how many locations are there where we have clear text information? A lot. And how secure are these? Well, that's a question mark. So we have this vulnerability as well. Now, a legitimate client can take their cell phone, plug it into their computer, and use the cellular connection to connect to the internet. Now, your desktop computer in the enterprise, instead of all communications to the internet go out through my firewall that I can monitor and control and regulate, now we have a parallel path out to the internet that I, from the corporate position, can't monitor. I don't even know it's occurring, and I can't even monitor it because it's going through a user's cellular telephone that's been tethered. So this is a breach of our security because we're bypassing network security. Wireless hotspots, Wi-Fi hotspots, like at Starbucks and other places where they want you to plunk down and spend the day because you'll order 16 cups of coffee and 14 carrot cakes while you're sitting there using their free internet at their hotspot. These are also very dangerous areas because very often they have either no security or very weak security. And as a result, the bad guy will plunk down there and he's just going to sniff all the traffic. And using a sniffer, a wireless sniffer, he can read every data packet that you send and receive in these hotspots if the security isn't strong. The cell phone can also store a whole lot of data. My cell phone has about, I think, 48 gigabytes of storage. That's a whole lot of data. So I can connect my cell phone to my computer at the office and download anything I want onto my cell phone, and you guys will never even know that I'm stealing all your secrets. The cell phone also has a camera. So in high security environments, I might be able to sneak my camera into your environment and take photographs that are otherwise unauthorized. And you're looking for a camera, well, my cell phone today has this camera built in. It also has an audio recorder, good for eavesdropping, and very often legitimate users will have data on their cell phone that is sensitive. And these cell phones are lost and stolen on a regular basis. So these are ways that data can be stolen through the cell phone. And in this case, it isn't a willful attempt to steal data from the company. You put data on there legitimately with a legitimate need, but now you lost your cell phone and some bad guy finds it and now has access to that sensitive information. So this has been a lesson on threats to networks, and we'll wrap up in the next lesson.